Good evening, commissioners and guests. Welcome to the May 2021 meeting of the OAC. This meeting is being recorded and will be made available on the DNR website probably day after tomorrow. We're going to start with welcome and introductions and a review of the agenda. In a few minutes, Quinn Fowler will be doing the roll call, followed by the approval of the past meeting summary. Then before we go to the status update by Dr. North, we'll ask Secretary Riccio to give us a few comments. Then Dr. North will give you a status update on the rating process. And then we will go to an overview of the prototype model, which will take a little over an hour, and then we'll take a short break. Then we will continue with model sample results from the model runs, and then at 8:45, Quinn Fowler will take over to open the floor for public comments. And then around 9, we shall adjourn. With that, I will turn it over to Quinn. Quinn?
Good evening, commissioners. A quorum being present, the meeting will come to order. Commissioner Cox, are you present? Commissioner Cox?
Taking roll.
Commissioner Bradley, are you present? Commissioner Bradley? Commissioner Brown, are you present? Commissioner Brown? Commissioner Breyer is present. Commissioner Busick, are you present? Commissioner Busick? Commissioner Colden's present. Commissioner Cover is present. Commissioner Dean is present. Commissioner Fithian, are you present? Commissioner Fithian? Commissioner Fowler, are you present? Commissioner Fowler? Commissioner Harrison's present. Commissioner Height, are you present? Commissioner Height? Commissioner Iliff, are you present? Commissioner Iliff? Commissioner Kanaki's present. Commissioner Leggett, are you present? Commissioner Leggett? Commissioner Miller's present. Commissioner Mullins present. Commissioner Pluta's present. Commissioner Waples, are you present? Commissioner Waples? Commissioner Ruth, are you present? Commissioner Ruth? Commissioner Shockley's present. Commissioner Sikorsky, are you present? Commissioner Sikorsky? Commissioner Swanson, are you present? Commissioner Swanson? Commissioner Webster, are you present?
Yeah, I'm present. I'm present.
Thank you. Commissioner Wilkins, are you present? Commissioner Wilkins?
And Quinn, this is Ann Swanson. I was present.
Perfect. Thank you. Commissioner Witt is present. Commissioner Corson, are you present? Commissioner Corson? Senator Elfrith is present. Senator Hershey, are you present? Senator Hershey? Delegate Holmes, are you present? Delegate Holmes? Commissioner Judy's present. Delegate Mouts, are you present?
His staffer is on the call for him.
Thank you. And Commissioner Sowers is present. The first business
Good
order.
evening.
Thank you, Commissioner Sowers. The first business order is approval of the minutes of the previous meeting. Are there any corrections to the minutes? There being no corrections, the minutes are approved as circulated. The next business order will be a status update from Dr. North.
Before we go there, just a second, before we go there, first of all, last month's meeting is available on the DNR website, the full recording. And before we go to a status update, I'd like to recognize Madam Secretary for a few comments, please.
Sure. Thank you, Quinn and Memo, and good evening to everyone and welcome. Thank you for attending the meeting. Just a quick reminder that the consensus model that we'll be discussing tonight is required by statute, but more importantly, I wanted to again point out that it is a really important tool for helping us all understand the potential effects of various management options that may be under consideration and ultimately helping to prioritize the actions and the recommendations that you want to make as we head toward the final stretch of the OAC. And so to that end, your feedback and input is going to be of the utmost importance tonight and going forward, just so we can bring all of these elements together in a very cohesive way. And with that in mind, I do want to take a second to commend Dr. Wilberg and Dr. North and their team for the incredible amount of work that has gone into this. And I think you will see what I mean when you see some of the preliminary and initial results that they will present this evening. Again, a lot of work has gone into this, but everyone's input is valuable and really important to this process. So thank you again, and look forward to continuing to get to our final product.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Before we continue, just a reminder, please, if you're not speaking, make sure your devices are muted. That way we avoid the echo in the background. Thank you very much. Quinn?
Our first business order will be a status update from Dr. North. Dr. North?
Thank you, Quinn. Memo, may I please share my screen? So I'd just like to give you an update of where we are in the consensus process. We are now entering into an important phase where so this arrow here is a looping arrow. It shows that we're going to be scanning multiple.
Elizabeth, you might have to redo that. You got cut off.
Oh, I did? Okay,
Yeah.
Should I start again?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Also, this is Ann Swanson. I'm just wondering if we have a lot of drain on the internet, and if anybody who doesn't need to have their video on should turn it off at this point. I'm not, you guys are in charge, but.
Okay, that's a good idea. So I wanted to let you all know that we're entering into another phase of the consensus process. We have multiple meetings now coming up where OAC members are going to be reviewing and evaluating the model and its predictions, and then using the model to compare and improve the options. Although we won't be rating any options today, we will be, towards the end of the meeting, working on improving some of the language for the modeled options, and talking about other ones that you all would like to be modeled. I also want to say that we will return to rating the non-modeled options in a future meeting, but this meeting is focusing on the model. And that's where we are.
Thank you. Dr. Wilberg?
Are you seeing my slides now?
Yes.
Okay. So what we're going to do in this first session is go through the Oyster consensus model as we have it currently set up. And then in the second half of the meeting, we're going to go through the options and the results of those options that we've been able to run to date. So that's where we're going. And so let's start off with, again, what our goal is with doing this model. And what we are trying to do is we want to be able to compare the potential outcomes of different management options for oyster management in Maryland. And so that means that we're going to start off with options. These are things that you're interested in considering in order to try and improve the situation for oysters in Maryland. We're going to simulate those options, and we're going to look at how well we expect them to work given what we think we know about how oysters work in Maryland. So the sorts of options that we're going to do, and some of the ones we're going to be able to discuss today, are the status quo. This is often one that we run in fisheries management just because the easiest thing to do is continue what you are doing. And so we want to see how well that works. We're also going to show the potential option for going back to the seed and shell program as it was from 1990 through about 2006. We're going to look at what happens when we implement the planned restoration efforts in the Minokan and St. Mary's rivers. We can also look at what happens if we decide to change sanctuary boundaries. We can look at increasing or decreasing plantings of all different types, whether they be shell, artificial substrate, spat on shell, or natural seed. The model has seed areas built into it, and so we can potentially look at redeveloping seed areas that could be used to develop and move natural seed around, as well as rotational harvest. Given those options, we plug those into the simulation model, and that allows us to forecast forward in time what we expect would happen to abundance, to harvest, to natural mortality, spat set, to shell, as well as some other performance measures that you'll get to see later this evening. And then the last thing that we do then is summarize this information, because we have the legislation that guides this project says we want to try to look at how well certain things do under alternative management. And so we want to look at the number of oysters. And so that's abundance. We want to look at harvest revenue, the amount of shell, the amount of nitrogen removal. And so based on feedback from the last time we talked about the model, we've included both the nitrogen removal that's on the bottom in the water, as well as the nitrogen that's removed when oysters are harvested. And then the other thing that we've added is the stock status relative to the reference points. And whoever is muted or not muted, if you could please mute your phone, I would appreciate it. So for the model, when we think about the biology and the fisheries, we've broken the year into 2 seasons. So if we think of the season as starting at the time of the harvest season, we have the harvest season occurring between April 1st or October 1st and March 30th. And then from April 1st to the end of September, that's when we have oyster reproduction happening, when we have growth of oysters, non-harvest mortality. So this includes disease mortality, mortality from fresh water, all of those sorts of things. We have habitat degradation happening during that period, as well as nitrogen removal. Or this is the nitrogen removal on bar. The model works at the level of the named oyster bar. And so we're tracking the oyster population and the amount of habitat on every one of these orange colored shapes. So there should be 1,082 of them here if you count really quick. And we're tracking the oyster population on each of those. And so it's a little bit different than the number of named oyster bars in Maryland, because we've broken them apart by the NOAA code boundaries, as well as by some of the sanctuary boundaries, in order to make sure we have all of those things in place and can talk about a portion of an oyster bar that is in one NOAA code versus another, or is in a sanctuary versus not in a sanctuary. So let's talk about what happens on one of those bars. And we're going to start off with the number of spat that are produced. And so once spat's set, they can do one of 2 things. They either die or they become small adult oysters the next year. The adult oysters have several fates that can happen to them. The first is they can die from natural causes, in which case they produce shell on the bottom, or they can be harvested. The third option is that they can stay surviving as adult oysters. We have bottom habitat that includes the new shell from dead oysters. It includes the amount of shell that live oysters have produced, and it includes the rest of the shell that's also on that oyster bar. And then completing the loop of the life cycle, we have adult oysters spawning. that produce larvae. Those larvae get dispersed among all the bars, and eventually some of them settle out as spat. And so we're modeling the mortality of the larvae as well as the mortality of the recently settled spat as part of this. So in the model, we separate the oysters into 3 categories, similar to what we do, or the same as what we do in the stock assessment. The youngest category is spat. These are all oysters less than 1 year old. We have small oysters. They're older than 1 year, but they're less than 3 inches in the length of their shell. And we have market oysters that are larger than 3 inches. Within the model, the population moves from small to large oysters through growth and survival. And so we have the ones that survive have the option to grow into the next age class. And we also are tracking the number of oysters that die in each of these different groups. On top of that, some of the oysters survive and stay in the same size. So not all small oysters grow into market-sized oysters. And actually, the fraction of small oysters that grow into market-sized oysters depends on which area of the bay they're in, because some parts of the bay have faster oyster growth than others. And then once an oyster becomes a market size, it always stays that size. The oysters can't shrink, which seems pretty reasonable. So in terms of modeling reproduction, we say that oyster spawning happens during the summer through early fall. Some of the oysters do change sex as they get older. And so market-sized oysters have a higher fraction female than small oysters do. And larger female oysters produce more eggs than small oysters do. So what that means in terms of the model is that for small oysters, they have a lower percent female than market-sized oysters, and they have fewer eggs per female than market-sized oysters. Once oysters produce those eggs, we model them spawning, and their larvae travel around to different parts of the bay based on the larval transport model, which incorporates information on the currents in the bay to try and track where oyster larvae are likely to end up. And so we're tracking among, I said we had 1,082 oyster bars. And so we're tracking all the potential connections among all those oyster bars. And so the larval transport model, what it currently provides in terms of information is the fraction of oysters that start off on one bar that end up on each of the other bars, including their starting location. After that, oysters need settlement oysters need habitat in order to settle on to begin their juvenile growth period. And so the model is tracking the amount of hard bottom on each bar. And the model also tracks the number of oysters that can settle on a bar. And so that ends up being something that we estimate when we're tuning the model to the data, which we'll see later on. And the model then estimates also the fraction of very young oysters that die. And so that represents the period between egg and about 3 months old. And the last thing we have for this is that a freshly planted shell has a higher settlement rate than old shell does. And this is based on some earlier analyses from the Department of Natural Resources Fall Dredge Survey that compared number of spat per amount of shell on freshly planted sites versus neighboring sites. For bottom habitat, we have bottom habitat in 4 different categories. And so, as I mentioned before, live oysters are part of that bottom habitat. There's a freshly planted shell category, an old shell category, and an artificial substrate category. So we have live oysters. When live oysters die, they become shell. We have freshly planted shell that gets lost at a higher rate per year than than the regular shell. And this is based on a study by Smith et al. We tracked the amount of what I'm just here calling old shell in the bay, as well as artificial substrate. And so these are things like reef ball or parts of bridges, other sorts of concrete things, granite, or other stone that's used for restoration. In terms of the loss of old shell in the model, we currently use a rate of 2.1% per year, and that's based on an analysis we did to look at how shell has changed over time in response to fishing. And so one of the reasons you don't see fishing loss on here is because those analyses suggested that there was not an estimable effect of fishing on oyster shell, and that's neither positive nor negative. And so when we go to look at the more detailed presentation of the model, we'll talk a bit more about the data for that. But we have analyzed it. Those are generally the results, and we haven't, therefore, we haven't included an effect of fishing on shell in the model. We also looked at spat set for that, and fishing also does not have an estimable effect on future spat set. And again, it's neither positive nor negative as far as we can estimate it from the data we have available. So again, in that analysis, we estimated a 2.1% per year loss of shell, and that's using fall dredge survey data. And then for artificial substrate, we don't have an estimated rate of loss for that. And as far as I'm aware of, we don't have one in the literature. And so we estimated that there would be a 1% per year loss, both because artificial substrate tends to come in larger chunks than oyster shell, as well as it's less soluble, so it won't dissolve like oyster shell does. The model includes 5 different fishing gears in it to represent the dominant gears that are found in Maryland. And so we have hand tongs, power dredge, sail dredge, patent tong, and diving all explicitly represented. And so each one of those 1,082 oyster bars in the model has a specific gear that's coded for fishing there. And it's based on the dominant gear that has historically been used on that site, as well as what the current regulations are. The way we model fishing is we basically say that watermen are extremely efficient at finding high densities of oysters and harvesting them in places where they're allowed to. And so we include a relationship that looks like this curve where we say the fraction of market-sized oysters that are harvested depends on what the density of market oysters is on the bottom. And so the more market-sized oysters there are, the larger the fraction of oysters that are going to be harvested there. And so we estimate what these relationships look like based on historical fishing that occurred between 1999 and 2019. We use different relationships for each gear. So hand tonging is going to look very different than, say, power dredging. Power dredging tends to be able to harvest oysters when they're at lower density than hand tonging. And we estimate these in different time periods, which correspond with different groups of regulations as well as periods of the fishery. So the fishery was relatively small during 1999 to 2011. Harvest increased pretty substantially from 2012 through 2018. And then we had a different set of regulations in place for 2019. And so we're trying to capture those different effects in the relationships. And again, these are all estimated relationships in the model by fitting the model to harvest on every one of those 1,082 oyster bars. The other part of the ecosystem services for oysters is nitrogen removal. And so the nitrogen removal on the bottom, so this is basically what's happening from largely bacterial activity in the sediments and in interstitial spaces around the shell within that community. And so previous studies have found that the higher the oyster, the higher the amount of oysters is in an area, or the biomass is what it would be if we weighed all the oysters that were there, that the more oysters that are in an area, the higher the amount of denitrification. And the relationships we've currently included in the model are based on ones that are described in a draft Kellogg et al. 2021 report. And so these are the data and the relationships. They're set up into 3 different seasons for spring, summer, and fall. As I mentioned before, we've added another component for nitrogen removal from harvested oysters, and this is specifically for the meats. The values for the amount of nitrogen in an oyster meat was taken from the calculations that were done for the nutrient credit trading system for aquaculture for diploid oysters. And so we're using the size categories that they have in that report don't exactly match the ones that are in our model. And so we did some averaging to get 0.07 grams of nitrogen for each small oyster that's harvested and 0.12 grams of nitrogen for market-sized oysters that are harvested. And so now we're going to get to the part where I want to talk about what's called conditioning the model. And so this is the part where I say we estimated some of these parameters, and we did that by fitting the model to a bunch of data. We fit the model to the data from the stock assessment estimates of abundance, and we fit the model to the hardest data on each bar in each year. And then we use those estimates to project forward with what the effects of the options are. So we have, it's actually 39 NOAA codes are included in the model. And so all of the blue shaded area is the area that's included in the model. And I just want to walk through how we compare the results for this. And so hopefully this is a review from last time you looked at this, but what we're going to see is a bunch of plots that look like this. So we have year across the bottom, and we have, in this case, abundance on the vertical axis. The line represents the model estimate, and the dot represents the estimate from the stock assessment estimate of abundance. And so in this case, you can see that this is for market-sized oysters in Eastern Bay, and you can see the oyster consensus model tracks the stock assessment estimates very well for that. And so we give this an overall grade of an A, and I'm going to show you a whole bunch of these, but I'm going to go through them fairly fast, which is one of the reasons why we distributed the report to you. But we want to see fits that look like this in terms of being this good a match between the assessment estimates and the model. And so I'm not going to dwell on all 36 NOAA codes worth of information here, but I just want to go through these just generally. In each row, we have a different NOAA code, and they're labeled at the top. So the top one here is the Big Anamessex River, Upper Bay, South Mid Bay, and Eastern Bay. Then we have in the columns, we have one column for spat. That's always the leftmost one. The middle one is for small oysters, and the right one is for market-sized oysters. Again, across the bottom axis, we have year, and on this side, we have number of oysters. And you can see for all of these, they fit the data quite well. I wouldn't quibble too much about over what an A versus an A minus is. I'm very pleased with how well we're getting this model to fit the data, and I don't have major reservations about it at this point. We've gotten it exactly to where I was hoping we'd be able to when we last talked about it. But I'm going to flip relatively quickly through all the NOAA codes. Now we're going to look at Fishing Bay, Honga River, Little Chop Tank, and the Minokan. And in each of those, again, we're fitting these patterns quite well over time. So the model's able to recreate the estimated abundance we get from the stock assessment. Now we're looking at the Miles River, the Nanakoke, Pocomoke Sound, and the St. Mary's River. And again, We're getting quite good matches between the oyster consensus model and the estimates that came out of the stock assessment. Now we're looking at the Severn River, Smith Creek, the South River, and the Wicomico River. This is the one in the Eastern Bay side. And overall, again, we're still having very good fits. This is a recurring theme throughout this to basically try and show you that we're able to match a lot of the ups and downs of oysters that have been observed in the last 20 years. Now we're looking at the Wye River, North Mid Bay, the Lower Bay, and the Lower Chester River. Again, quite good matches across the board. When we switch to the Lower Choptank River, the Lower Patuxent River, Breton and St. Clements Bay, and Tangier Sound, of these, the Breton and St. Clements Bay is a little bit different, and the main reason it's different is we discovered that there was some planting information for this bay that hadn't been included in the stock assessment, and so that's why the difference is as big as it is there. We're going to correct that in the upcoming stock assessments, as well as get that incorporated into the oyster consensus model as well. And then the, let's see, we have the lower bay on the western side, the mid-Chester River, mid-Choptank River, mid-Patuxent River. Again, we're doing fairly well with, again, a few plantings that were missed from the previous stock assessment. The Wicomico River on the western side, up the Potomac, Tangier Sound, the Upper Chester River and Upper Choptank River are all looking pretty good as well. And then last but not least, we have the Upper Patuxent River, Harris Creek, Broad Creek, and the Tread Avon. And we're matching the patterns in all of those reasonably well. And so the last part I want to talk about is the fit to the overall harvest data. I'm not going to go through and torture you with looking at over 1,000 plots of what the harvest looks like on every oyster bar, but this is the fit to the overall harvest data, and the model is able to recreate the patterns that we've seen during this period particularly well. And here I'm particularly focusing on the information that's in place since the harvester reports have been implemented. So prior to, I think it's 2011, we're using buy ticket information, and after that, we're using the harvester reports. And so with that, I will stop there and be happy to take any questions on the model that we've set up or anything about estimating the parameters of that model.
Thank you, Dr. Wilbur. If there are any questions, please raise your hand or type them in the chat. Commissioner Harrison.
Yeah, Mike. On the loss of shell, the new shell plantings, it was 30% per year. Are you trying to say after 4 years there's no shell left there?
Yeah, there's almost no shell left. And so what the Smith et al. Paper study found is they went back and looked at sites where DNR had planted shell, and they did fairly extensive surveys in many of those locations. And they found that after 5 years, pretty much all the planted shell was either completely silted over or missing. And so most of what they found was that shell silting over.
Yeah, I find that hard to believe. I mean, I don't know what the time span was, but or when that was done, but it seems like to me now we're not seeing that at all. I'm assuming that if there is better spat sets on those shell, that they don't get sanded, is what I think. And I think that number is awful high. Is all I'm saying.
Okay, that's definitely something we can look at.
Mike, Chris Judy.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, okay. So, I thought that was a little bit high, and I think Jeff has a good point. So I'd be glad to look over Gary Smith's report with you, and we can discuss it. One thing I did discuss with Gary before he passed away, he mentioned something about his estimate sometimes wasn't so much the actual loss of shell, and we can dig through his report. he said something to me about he was also looking at degradation, so that a shell planting over a number of years became as if it was a natural bar. So in other words, the shells weren't necessarily gone, but they were degraded, silted. So we can discuss later to flesh out Jeff's point, but I do remember that conversation from Gary that some of his point he was trying to make wasn't total loss, gone from the world. It was degradation, so that now for many years it would only perform as a natural bar, a degraded, silty bar. So we can discuss later.
Yeah, and it'll be good when I'll show you more specifically exactly what we're doing with how planted shell both gets lost and gets converted into what a natural oyster bar looks like within the model when we do the small group sessions. But those are good points to consider, and it's one of the things that we might want to consider a major source of uncertainty that we explore how different options perform in light of it.
Thank you. Commissioner Colden and Commissioner Breyer.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike, for the presentation and all the work that you and the team have done so far on this. My question is also related to some of the shell loss and habitat terms. And specifically, I think you were talking about the information that you all analyzed, maybe from the power dredge studies that we've referenced before, about the no net effect of fishing on shell loss over time. My knowledge is that it's a little bit different from some of the previous studies from North Carolina, for example. So I was just wondering if you all have or could plan to do some sensitivity analysis around the assumption that there's no effect of fishing on habitat.
Certainly. So there's several things to talk about with that. The first is I'll describe the analysis that we did. So we analyzed both the data that were collected from the areas that were open to power dredging that were then later sampled using patent tongs. And so we analyzed that data set. And at the same time, we also analyzed all the fall dredge survey data since 2000, since we had harvester reports. And that the fishing activities in combination with the fall dredge survey, and looked at the effects of basically years of high fishing versus years of low fishing and their effect on the future amount of shell that was caught in the fall dredge survey each of those years. And in doing all of that, that's where we come up with the estimates of no significant effect of a reduction in the amount of shell. I'll say that's quite a different study than the North Carolina one that you mentioned. And in the North Carolina one, what they were specifically looking at is relatively small and tall shell piles that they put out that they then had people come out and fish. And so if you have a shell pile, I forget how big their shell piles were, but I don't think they were more than about 40 feet. And they were quite tall. They were up to like 2 feet tall. And so if somebody comes through that with a dredge or even with tongs, it tended to spread the shell out a lot. And so they lost a lot of height. But I think that that's a very different situation than the oyster shell that we have in Maryland. And I will say we did try to do a run where we included the estimates from our analysis of the amount of shell change with fishing and its uncertainty, and it made the model blow up when we tried it. We can go back and try it again, but we'll have to talk a little bit about what we might be able to do to represent that uncertainty. But we have tried a little bit on that, and it hasn't worked yet.
Could I have a quick follow-up?
Yeah, please.
So for the analysis of looking at the high fishing years versus low fishing years relative to the fall dredge survey, obviously that fall dredge survey happens the same time that a lot of the fishing activity is going on. So was there sort of an offset, like a time lag offset for that to get at the previous year's effect on the current year's fall dredge survey results?
No, we didn't account for that. So, but that is a good point of something to think about. Yeah, we can go back and look at that a little bit and at least think about it some more.
Commissioner Breyer?
Thanks, Mike. Really appreciate all this, an incredible amount of work. Two questions. One, following up on Allison's question, just to ask you, just for my benefit, maybe I'm being naive here, to help explain a mechanism by which shell is not removed, or it does, you didn't build in removal from fishing of shell. So like, what's the mechanism by which that occurs? I'm not trying to be noxious. I'm just trying to understand.
No worries. So first off, shell is removed from fishing. The shell from the live oysters is actually taken out in the model, just like it is in the real world. So that portion of the shell is removed. What we're talking about is what fishing does to the rest of the reef.
Gotcha.
And so there's very few papers or studies that have been out in the literature looking at that. The ones that have done it, like that North Carolina one that Alice and I were just talking about, have done it in what I think of as highly artificial situations that don't represent most of Maryland, and that they're fishing on these big high shell piles. And so when we look at that, we're basically looking for, are there negative or positive effects of working the bottom for oysters? And we basically did not find substantial evidence of either negative or positive effects. So that's what I was specifically referencing.
Gotcha. That's helpful. Thanks. Second question was about the denitrification work, and I just wanted to clarify. You showed 4 graphs. One was, I think, meat removal, and the other was sort of denitrification. Am I getting that right?
Yes.
With the slide. So the question on the bottom, a reef removal, did that include the other filters on the reef? Because that's I know I've read an article and helped fund some of that work, and it showed up to 40% or more additional filtration from rib mussels and all sorts of other good stuff.
So yes, that denitrification rate includes the whole community of organisms on the reef.
Cool. Thank you.
Cool.
Commissioner Sowers?
Yeah, hi, Mike. Just a quick question. Is there any mechanism in the model that factors in if a oyster is oriented into the water column, like a 3-dimensional reef, versus if it is flat on the bottom?
No, we don't have that sort of, I guess, granular detail in the model about kind of what direction the oysters are pointing.
Okay, thanks. That's what I expected. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, we do have oyster densities which do relate to that. In places where there's high oyster densities, the only way they get that way is by being vertical, whereas at low oyster densities, they tend to be at weird angles, I would expect. But short of that, we don't have any difference in oyster reproductive rates or how they filter or denitrify or anything like that based on orientation.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks.
Do we have any other comments or questions for Dr. Wilberg?
Quinn, this is Ann Swanson. I do have a quick question. I can't seem to find my raising of my hand.
Commissioner Swanson?
Okay. Just a question about predation. So periodically we have significant predation from things like rays. And how was that sort of mortality factored in? Was that part of natural mortality or?
So yes, that would be part of natural mortality. And this brings up an important point I forgot to mention is you'll notice that I didn't mention aquaculture when I described the model. And that's because we haven't implemented aquaculture yet. And it's one of the discussions I want to have with the OAC about how important it is to include aquaculture in the model. And so essentially with all the other stuff, we prioritize putting in and getting that done, and the aquaculture model kind of languished in the background. So the reports, at least that I've heard about rays eating oysters, have primarily come from people's aquaculture, on-bottom aquaculture facilities. And so I'm not aware of that sort of phenomenon being seen on natural oyster bars, but it would be included in the natural mortality rates that we have. So every bar has a different natural mortality rate for each year. And so that represents all sorts of things. It represents mortality from low salinity in some years. It represents disease mortality. It represents mortality from oyster drills and other predators. And so all of those things are incorporated in the model, but we don't have a specific number that we say, this is the fraction that get eaten by cow-nose rays, or this is the fraction that get eaten by other predators.
Thank you very much. And thank you for this phenomenal work.
Commissioner Miller, then Commissioner Colden, then Commissioner Corson. Commissioner Miller.
Thank you, Quinn. And I'll echo everyone else's comments, Mike. Thanks for a great job on pulling this together. You know this model better than anyone else. So I'm going to ask you, what should we be worried about?
So the one of the big problems we had, and why the model development has taken as long as it is, or as long as it has, is that I would say the information that we have on the amount of habitat that's currently out there isn't great. And so we try and let the model determine where there's good habitat and where there's not, based on oyster surveys, as well as on, primarily though, on the amount of harvest that's happened. And so with the idea that oysters only grow and get harvested in places where there's pretty good habitat. And so I would say right now, that's what I think the biggest weakness of the model is. And when we get to the forecast results, I think you'll see a little bit more about why I would say I'm concerned a bit about how we're modeling the habitat. All of that hasn't come together quite like I would have hoped. So I guess I'll stop there in terms of the habitat being my biggest concern, I guess, of the model.
And then just as a quick follow-up, then what's the flip side of that coin? What are the bits that you think really hang together well and we should hang our hats on?
So I'm pretty happy with how well we've been able to get the abundance estimates from the assessment and the harvest estimates on each bar to be able to match up. When we started this, it wasn't guaranteed that when we changed the spatial scale that we're looking at things from the NOAA code level to the bar level, that essentially everything will add up correctly. And so our ability to be able to do that and be able to match the data really quite well is something that I've been quite happy with. And one of the reasons I'm saying that is because we're not letting just everything change on the bar specific level. We're saying that when recruitment is good on a bar, it's good across all the bars in a NOAA code. And similarly, when natural mortality is bad, it's bad across all the bars in a NOAA code. And so even with those sorts of spatial levels of natural mortality rate and recruitment, the model is still able to match all these things better than I was actually expecting it would when we started this project. So that we're able to match the data that well, I'm very pleased with.
Commissioner Colden.
Thank you. Appreciate another bite at the apple here. I have lots of questions, but I'll put the remainder in the chat. So maybe that we can follow up separately, or if somebody else wants to glom on to one of those questions, they can do that. My question was, Mike, I think I saw a rate included for nitrogen removal for harvested smalls, but of course, harvested smalls are not legal. So can you explain the inclusion of nitrogen removal for small oysters?
Sure. Harvested smalls are legal. They just have to make up less than 5% of a bushel by volume. And so the model does include harvest of small oysters. And so, and it is legal, but it's just basically below that threshold is what it has to be. And so that's why it's included.
Okay, thanks. I know that's an ongoing question right now with the department, so I'll be interested to see if the model needs to be adjusted as that conversation continues.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Commissioner Corson?
Thanks, Mike. This looks great. Looks like maybe a big step forward towards possibly biological reference points. Pretty exciting. Just a quick kind of a blockheaded question. When you say that one activity or another, be it fishing or something else, doesn't have a positive or negative effect, can you clarify on what? I know it sounds sort of silly, but you talked about spat, you talked about smalls, you talked about reef, then, you know, so I'm just not totally clear on what we're talking about.
Sure. So we did two sets of analyses. The first one looked at whether or not the change in the amount of culch that was gathered in the fall dredge survey was related to the amount of fishing that happened on that site. And so we related it to the number, or basically we related to the amount of harvest per square meter of the oyster bar. So basically how many oysters are pulled out relative to the footprint of that area. And when we did that, we did not, basically none of the estimates were significantly different from zero, which in plain English terms essentially means we were not able to detect either a positive or negative effect on the bottom. We also looked at whether or not the spat set looked like it was higher or lower on areas that had more or less fishing that following year after the harvest season. And so that was the other one that we looked at. And in that analysis, we also did not detect an effect of harvest, either positive or negative, on the number of spat that were there the next season. And so that's specifically the two kind of branches of the analyses we looked at.
Great, thank you.
Commissioner Harrison?
Yeah, yes, Mike, you said that the 2020 info isn't in the model yet because the stock assessment is now. And what I was wondering is, since we had such a really good spat set on the Eastern Shore from Chop Tank south, and one that probably hasn't occurred as big as it is since who knows when, I'm sure before 1999. I mean, how that's really going to affect the model. I mean, when you put that information, isn't the model going to explode? I mean, you know, the spat sets were so great. Do you think that that's what's going to happen? And I mean, could it have forecasted this outcome? Is it set up to do that, since it really hasn't happened this way in any time that I can remember? Just wondering about that.
So I can't tell you specifically if the model would forecast exactly like it's turned out in the last year. I will show you the amount of variability that's in the model results, and things looking much better in 2020 is a possibility under the model. And so from that perspective, yes, it can happen, but it's not a frequent event in the model. The other part is I'm hoping that we're going to be able to update the oyster consensus model through 2020 after the next updated stock assessment is done. And part of the reason for that is I mentioned a couple of the areas where we didn't have the full time series of planted oysters in correctly and stuff. I would really like to fix that up so that we're using what we think is the absolute best data we can for this effort, which is always my goal, but we always want to try and maintain that. So So yeah, I think we'll be doing that, in which case, hopefully we'll see that spat set, because if it's showing up in the fall dredge survey and so on, it should be there, and it should drive an uptick in those numbers, produce a more realistic starting point for our simulations.
Commissioner Shockley.
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. So my questions, you had mentioned earlier that it was still being discussed as to how aquaculture was going to be modeled. I guess I've got some just questions about how an enhanced aquaculture industry and a enhanced wild fishery, as we've seen in the last couple of years, could be a big attribute. A big attribute from an enhanced processing operations in industry in the state, which will result in more shell coming forth, especially from aquaculture, because we start with zero shell basically with a large part of our operations. That, and also if you're going to be looking at how nutrient credit trading and an added layer of value coming into aquaculture especially, but eventually maybe into the wild fishery, would add into the expansion of those industries and enhance the expansion of everything I just mentioned. I think that could be a very valuable thing to model.
Yeah, and I agree with you completely. It's more just coming down to prioritization at this point. It was something we originally wanted to include in the model for exactly the reasons that you brought up, in terms of there's a bit of a synergy potentially with aquaculture and the wild fishery. It's just been that, one, given our focus of trying to get the wild population right, as well as having less information available for aquaculture, has made it a bit challenging to develop that sort of model. So it's another reason it's been put on the back burner. But like I said, it's still something that we can do. It'll just be a question of going forward, if we're going to complete this project by its deadline, we're going to have to prioritize exactly which things we try to build into the model. And given that we haven't done that one yet, it's one of the ones that's on the table.
Commissioner Swanson.
Yeah, thanks. Mike, just two additional questions. One, kind of taking off of the discussion that just happened. Earlier in the slides, you had different values for different size oysters when you were talking about nitrogen removal. But one of them was for small oysters, the 0.07 grams of nitrogen removal. And since aquaculture is not modeled, then what is that for? Is that for illegal harvest, or how are you using that in the current model? That would be one question. And then after that, I do have just one other.
Sure. So the answer for that one's pretty quick. The model includes some incidental harvests of small oysters as part of the regular harvest, and it comes out. I need to look exactly at what the numbers are, but it's a lower value that's consistent with both the current law, which says that up to 5% of a bushel can be small. The 5% by volume of a bushel can be small. And so that's why it's in there, because there is incidental harvest of the small oysters, and it's something we've observed when we've looked at the composition of oysters.
Okay, and then the other question has to do with the tracking of oyster shell. And it looked like the newly dead oysters from natural mortality, you were putting in the old shell pool. Yet why would that be treated differently from the shell coming from shucking houses? Because essentially it's the same thing, which is an empty shell available for substrate.
That's a really good point, and you have a really good eye. That's actually an error in the boxes and arrows I drew. In the way we have it implemented in the model, it actually does exactly what you said, where newly dead oysters become that fresh oyster shell, which then generate or have a higher spat set on them.
Okay, thanks.
Dr. Wilbur, would you please read some of the comments, questions in the chat?
Sure. So the first one is from Jeff Cornwell, basically saying that the denitrification is indeed for the whole community of organisms on the bottom. And so that they also see high rates of denitrification associated with other fouling communities like barnacles and bryozoans. Allison Colden asks, is there a trend in the dominant gear type in the 3 timeframes, the 1999 to 2011, 2012 to 2018, and 2019, that relates to the amount of effort? Does the amount of shell from, for the first question there, there's not really a trend in the dominant gear type. Hand tongue and power dredge vie for the largest fraction of the harvest. I think power dredge is just slightly a little bit more. If I'm remembering right, and this is off the top of my head, but I think it's like a little over 30% of the total harvest is hand tongue, and about a little over 30% is also power dredge. And then the other 3 gears make up the remaining 40%. But there, I don't remember there being a strong trend across the different gear types. Does the model attribute shell to recently dead oysters to the dead shell pool? We just talked about that with Anne's question. And then when a bar straddles a NOAA code or a sanctuary line, how did you parse out the oyster density? So what we do is, we have the area of each side, and actually because we didn't have oyster abundance estimates on each bar to start with, we don't need to divide it up among the 2. Rather, what it's doing is it's basically treating a part of a bar that's in a NOAA code exactly the same as it does its own separate bar in that NOAA code. And so based on the harvest that's reported to that bar within that NOAA code, as well as if we have habitat data on that bar in that NOAA code, it's basing the amount of oysters on that information. Let's see if I got everything. Yeah, I think I have everything from that.
Perfect. Are there any more comments or questions? Anyone wants to raise their hand before we go to the chat again?
Quinn, there's one more comments that I'll go through. The first is that with so much concern about the accuracy of the stock assessment, is it really a great thing that the model matches the outcome of the stock assessment? From my perspective, the stock assessment is our best estimates of abundance of oysters in the bay. And if we are unable to match those, then that would be bad. Yes, the stock assessment is not perfect, and it's not a perfect estimate of abundance, but we never have a perfect estimate of abundance. Even with humans in the US, when we can ask people, we don't get a perfect census of the population. We should always expect error. The model is using 5% of harvested oysters as small incidental oyster. The number is exaggerated. Where does the number come from? From the little bit of data that we have on it, which granted is a small non-random set of observations, we actually estimate that 7% by number of oysters that have been harvested are small. So 5% I think is in the ballpark. I didn't present what the actual fraction of small oysters being harvested in the model actually turns out to be. And so that's something I'll have next time I present it to folks so that we actually have it. But there's a lot of variability in how many small oysters there are per bushel. But there is a fair amount of small oyster harvest, as I mentioned before, is allowed by law.
Commissioner Dean, do you have a question?
Yeah, real quick, it's back to the stock assessment. You know, I understand that it is our best available data science, but I said it from day one, the stock assessment is what cost the industry so much the last 2 years. I think it really needs to be cleared up, it needs to be followed up, and it needs to be fine-tuned. I mean, we took, I believe it was a 30% reduction. 30% reduction is huge in an industry. I get it. And Mike, thank you for your work. I think we got to start from something solid. Thank you.
Sure. And there are ways that we could look at the effects of uncertainty in the stock assessment as to how those affect our projections going forward. And I'll think about that some more, as part of this whole process is to try and understand what are our major sources of uncertainty, and do the potential options we might want to consider, does the performance of those change based on some of the assumptions we're making into the analysis. And so it's a good point. And I would never say that we know the population exactly. And so we can think about what it actually, ways we might be able to test that more thoroughly.
Hey, Mike, with that, you know, 2 years ago, that stock assessment classified a lot of areas overfished. And I would say the last 2 years of harvest would definitely prove otherwise.
So this has been one of the challenges that we've had in trying to communicate what the stock assessment results actually mean. To be over harvesting in 1 year is not necessarily terrible. The situation we don't want to be in is where we do that every year, year after year after year. And so that's the part where I recognize that obviously the results from the most recent year are the ones that were used to justify changes in the regulation and so on. But it's the model isn't trying to say that exceeding the harvest rate limits in 1 year is terrible. It's that we don't want to do it year after year after year. So, but we'll get actually to a little bit more of that, because in some of the projections, we're also showing what the stock status relative to the reference points from the stock assessment would look like going forward. So there's definitely more room to consider those, and I definitely take your point.
Do we have any other comments or questions from commissioners?
Mike, why don't we take an early break at this point and then continue in about 10-15 minutes with the second part? Is that okay?
That works for me.
Okay, everybody, we're going to take a short break. It is now 7, let's say it's 7:10. We'll be back at 7:20. Is that okay? Very good. We'll take a short break. See you all at 7:20. Welcome back, commissioners and guests. This is the second half of the May 2021 OAC meeting. Before we get started, just wanted to remind everybody that this session is being recorded and the recording will be made available via the DNR website in 24 to 48 hours. Mike?
Great, thank you, Memo. Let me pull up my screen again. So now I'm going to go through some of the options we use to simulate the model forward and do forecasts of what those options might look like. And I do want to say at this point, don't take anything as set in stone. I'm expecting that based on our conversations today, as well as our conversations at the small group meetings, that we're going to be making changes to the model, to the options, or both. And so it's, I think, safest right now to treat these as informative trials, but I wouldn't expect the results to stay exactly the same going forward because we probably will continue to make changes in the short term. And so the things that we're going to look at in terms of forecasts are we're going to look at the forecasts of adult oyster abundance for small and market-sized oysters combined, market abundance, which is obviously just market oysters, the amount of harvest in bushels, the harvest revenue in dollars, the amount of shell in the system, and this is the one I was talking about in response to Tom's comment about things that look a little bit different than I would expect. The amount of nitrogen removal on oyster bars, the amount of nitrogen removal from meats, and the last one would say the fraction of the time we're below the minimum abundance limit from the stock assessment and the fraction of the time we're above the target or the maximum harvest limit from the stock assessment. So to date, what I have to show you are the results from 9 different options that we've ran. The first is the status quo. What happens if we continue everything as it is? The next is to implement the seed and shell program as it was during 1990 through 2006. The third one is to complete the planned restoration efforts in the Summaries and Minokan rivers. The next is to return to regulations from 2018. So those are the regulations that we were just talking about, which had higher daily bushel limits and a fishery open on Wednesday. The next is to keep the current regulations, but stop all planting. This is one of the runs that's just a test run because it's something that's relatively easy to do in the model, and it's an interesting evaluation of what's the effect of the current planting efforts. Some of the other ones are ones that folks had asked about in various forms in previous meetings. So one is opening Upper Bay non-sanctuaries to power dredging above the Bay Bridge. So basically the areas that were formerly sanctuaries would still stay sanctuaries, but the areas that weren't would be open to power dredging. The next is kind of a different side of that. Is this one has more sanctuaries where we basically make all the oyster bars in the bay that have less than 200 bushels harvested cumulatively during 1999 to 2019. We turn those into sanctuaries. And so it makes somewhere around 50%, 60% of the bars sanctuary. Then what happens if we open all non-restoration sanctuaries to fishing? And then the last one is an Upper Bay restoration one, which is using $500,000 per year for spat on shell to place on 3 different oyster bars each year in the Upper Bay to try and do some restoration work. So these are the 9 options we already have programmed. We also have, or that I have results to show you today. We also have programmed and about ready to set up or about ready to run some options that model dredging man-o-war shoals, as well as an option for doing some restoration and rotational harvest in the Chester River. But those are ones that we don't have the options run yet. So what I want to do is go through some maps of what these options look like on space. And so first I'm going to go through the status quo of what areas are open to fishing, where we're doing different planting activities in the model, and so on. And then we will go to the different options and how they differ from the status quo. So on this map, each of the different oyster bars in the model is outlined in the bay. And here the purple ones are the ones that are open to fishing. The gray ones are the ones that are close to fishing in the current version of the status quo that we have implemented. Some of the areas are small and so they're hard to see. And so like there are oyster bars in St. Mary's River, but they're hard to see. I'll show you some zoomed in stuff for that later. And let's see, I didn't put these in the right order when I did them. So let's look at some of the ones where we change where fishing is allowed and where it isn't. So this is the option where we make more sanctuaries by basically making anything where there hasn't been a history of very much harvest into a sanctuary. So you can see we get a lot more gray bars and these are the areas that have very little harvest being reported historically. The next one is what happens if we turn basically all non-restoration sanctuaries into open public areas. And so you can see that pretty much most of the area that you can see on the map turns purple from that, but Harris Creek, the Little Chop Tank, Tread Avon, St. Mary's and Minokan rivers are still largely sanctuary. If we look at what the spat on shell plantings look like for the status quo, what we did in order to set up the spat on shell and natural seed and amount of shell in this model is we went back and looked at on average how much shell was placed on which different bars and how often that was done. And so we based these on average rates. So let's say a bar was planted 4 times in the last 20 years. What we would do is we would take the average amount of spat on shell that was planted on that bar, and then we would say it's going to happen every 4 years or every 5 years, I guess, if it was 4 in the last 20. So every 5 years, it would happen in the model. And so we did that by looking at the activities on every bar and came up with that sort of schedule for doing things. But we restricted the activities to the bars where it historically happened so that we weren't doing stuff in places where people would immediately think it was a bad idea, or we were at least hoping to avoid that. So here you can see all the purple areas are the areas where we have records of spat on shell being planted during the last 20 years. And so the status quo includes planting spat on shell on those bars. If we look at the spat on shell plantings for completing the sanctuary restoration efforts, the 2 places where we have that are in the upper St. Mary's River and in the Minokan River. And so these are the areas that have, I hope, matches with the blueprints, but we'll check with folks later, or if folks have comments about whether we get these about right or not. That's exactly the sort of thing we want to get feedback on, about whether we're implementing these correctly. If we look at the spat on shell plantings for the Upper Bay restoration efforts, it includes the spat on shell plantings that are in the status quo, and then we actually have more spat on shell plantings that we include in the Upper Bay. Which is the area above the Bay Bridge. Is all of that, including the Chester River, is what I'm calling the Upper Bay in this. If we look at where shell plantings have happened, again, the areas in purple are the places where we have shell plantings in the data sets that we're using. And so those are the areas where we have shell additions. And again, we're using average amounts on each of these bar and an average frequency that matches what has happened over the last 20 some odd years. Let's see, somehow these got out of order, so I apologize for jumping around. This should actually say, I think, just shell plantings under the seed and shell option, not spat on shell plantings. And so when, again, we looked, this one, we took a look a bit farther back to 1990 at where shell had been placed. And so we have these areas identified for where shell placements were historically put under the old seed and shell program. And so we're trying to mimic that. We have seed bars located, and so the model is set up so that shell is put down on a seed bar, and then later that shell is collected with the spat and used to put elsewhere. And so the historical areas that were identified as seed bars are located in purple. For the natural seed, for the status quo, we have the purple areas here as highlighted as areas that get natural seed. And then under the seed and shell planting, you can see there's quite a few more areas that get that natural seed. But in this one, the amount of natural seed that's placed is constrained so that it's only the amount collected on the seed areas. So we have the seed areas linked where basically when you take oysters from a seed area, they get taken off of that bar, and then those oysters get distributed to all the other bars that are supposed to be planted that year. In terms of alternate substrate, I think the places where alternate substrate is included is pretty small. For the status quo, we didn't do the same thing we did before because the major places where alternate substrate was used were in the restoration efforts, particularly for Harris Creek. And so we weren't saying that activity was going to continue forward. So the alternate substrate plantings are pretty small. Right now in the base model. I meant to go back and check exactly where they were, but I forgot to do that while I was eating dinner. The only option that we're looking at that changes where alternate substrate gets put forward is in the complete sanctuary restoration efforts. And so right now, these are the areas where I believe we have that alternate substrate being planted. But again, it looks like we need to cross-reference that with the tributary plan again. And so now I want to switch into talking about how we'll present the results and then walk through these scenarios. And I've got a lot of stuff I can show you, but it can be overwhelming when you first look at it, which is one of the reasons why we sent out the presentation before the meeting, but I recognize that you're going to need a lot more time to look at it and think about it. And that's one of the things we're going to be doing over the next several months because these can be very dense and hard to get through. And there's just a lot of information. So what I'm going to show you right now are really large scale summaries of the results. And so some of the plots I'm going to show you are going to look like this, where we're looking at a forecast of how we expect things to happen going forward over time, where across the bottom of the graph, we'll have the year. On the vertical, we'll have one of the performance measures. In this case, it's adult abundance in millions. We can see the starting point for the model as the median line. So basically the black line in the middle is the thing I want you most to focus on in the graph. Basically says that 50% of the model runs end up being higher than that, 50% end up being lower than that. So it's the exact middle of what we forecast forward. We forecasted 500 different alternate realities forward with this model. And And then the gray area is the amount of variability we get from those forecasts. So we get this amount of variability because we have uncertainty in how many oysters we're starting with in 2020. And so that goes back to Jeff and Simon's questions about whether the model can replicate what we're currently seeing in 2020, as well as what the uncertainty in the assessment is. And so we have some of that built in. And then the uncertainty gets bigger as it goes forward, because while our uncertainty about how many oysters there are now is a moderate to perhaps some would say high amount, our uncertainty about what's going to happen in the future is bigger, because we don't know exactly what's going to happen with spat sets. We don't know what's going to happen with natural mortality rates and so on. So we characterize that going forward by the bottom line is where the lower 10th percentile of the results are, and the top line is where the upper 90th percentile is. And so that means that this shaded gray area, and it'll be blue on the graphs coming up, is enclosing 90% of the results, or I mean 80% of the results. So this is the area that's most likely to happen, but we're largely going to focus on this middle value when we're going to do comparisons. So let's start off with the forecast we get from the status quo. And so this is the estimate of adult abundance from the status quo. I'm going to show one plot, and then I'm going to put a whole bunch up for all the other performance measures. And we're going to go through each of them. And it's probably going to be painful for a couple slides. Then I'm going to show you some way that I think will be a little bit easier to make comparisons among the different potential options, which is what we really want to do with this. So what this model is saying is we're starting off with adult abundance of about 750 million oysters in the model, that adult abundance is projected to decline in the short term and then increase after that. However, there is a substantial amount of uncertainty in those values. Notice that also this doesn't go all the way down to zero, so the amount of change in this is exaggerated. And so we can do this for all the different performance measures. And so the forecasts are suggesting that nitrogen removal from harvest is likely to increase into the future. And that's because harvest has a increasing trend through the future, although the first couple of years do show a suggested decline of what would be expected. Market abundance follows a similar pattern, or follows a pattern where we see a decline in the beginning and then a leveling off, and market abundance stays the same after that, or approximately the same. Let's see, what do I want to concentrate on? Let's go through the other ones that are similar. So harvest revenue is one that matches harvest. We've just converted the axes from, these are in thousands of bushels, so starting off at 250,000 bushels up to an average of about 350,000 bushels. Whereas harvest revenue starts off at about 11 or $12 million, and then at the end gets up to maybe $15 million. And so the other ones that we want to look at are the nitrogen removal on oyster bars follows a similar pattern to market-sized oysters, where there's an early decline and then a leveling off. Again, keep in mind that the amount of change on these axes is somewhat exaggerated because the scales don't include zero. The other three I want to concentrate on before I go to surface shell is these three represent the stock status in the sense of, are we above or below the limits and targets that are set up in the stock assessment in terms of the harvest rate, which is what fraction of oysters are harvested, or fraction of market-sized oysters harvested. And so the way we get these lines, or the way you would read this, is it suggests that about almost 45% of the NOAA codes in a given year would have a harvest rate that's above the limit harvest rate. And this is a similar metric for above the target harvest rate. So if you're above the limit, you also have to be above the target in the way we calculated these. And then the other metric here is below the minimum abundance level that was estimated in the stock assessment. And so this suggests that we go from low levels to start with up to having about 35% of the NOAA codes below their minimum. And so what this is suggesting is there's some NOAA codes where oyster abundance has continued to decline. So it's what I would expect, because the way the abundance limit was estimated in the stock assessment was it was the minimum value from 1999 to 2019. So it's the minimum abundance during that period. And so basically anytime the abundance dips below that, we're going to get a trigger on that graph. And so this basically says there's some NOAA codes where the model expects a continued decrease in abundance. And then the last one, which is one I mentioned earlier, was this surface shell. So this is the total amount of oyster habitat that we estimate in the bay. This is in thousands of liters, so it's a little bit hard to recognize what that axis is or understand what that axis is. But we're seeing pretty much a steady decline of this. And it's basically saying that throughout all of these forecasts, there's not a situation where there's enough oysters to offset that loss of 2.1% of habitat every year. And so there's not enough oysters out there to offset that. And that's something that we need to, I think, take, or at least think harder about the realism of this trend relative to relative to what we think should be happening. But it's definitely worthy of consideration, and it's not something we have a lot of data on. So now I'm going to switch to the next option, and then I promise I'll stop overloading you with these graphs. And so I want to show a different one, and this is for the seed and shell program. And I'll go through these a little bit faster, and then I'll show you a graph that I hope makes the comparisons easier after talking about how we get there. So again, these plots are in the same order. What we've done is we've switched which option we're forecasting forward in the model. So instead of using status quo regulations, now we've implemented what we have representing the seed and shell program, where essentially shell is placed down in certain places. We have seed bars. The seed is collected from those bars and spread out to other bars. And that is all tracked within the model. And here we have adult abundance, again showing an initial decline and then an increase. The abundance ends up, adult abundance ends up being higher than what it was in the status quo. The amount of harvest, we also see a much bigger increase than what it was under the status quo. The total harvest ends up being bigger. The amount of market abundance doesn't end up changing all that much relative to the status quo, although you do see a bit of a tick up at the end. The amount of harvest revenue follows harvest as before. So some of these metrics end up being quite similar to others because this is just harvest in bushels times price per bushel. The amount of nitrogen removal is similar to the overall market abundance of oysters. When we look at the harvest rates and the harvest target relative to the limit, this option reduces the fraction of the time the harvest rate is above the limit that's identified. It makes sense because part of calculating whether or not you're above the harvest limit has to do with accounting for planted oysters. So harvesting planted oysters doesn't get counted against the harvest rate. And so we're doing the same thing when we do these calculations. So this option ends up being better for maintaining better stock status. And being below the minimum abundance in this case also ends up being better. So the not as many NOAA codes end up being below their abundance limit, and that number decreases, which this decreasing is a good thing. It means that there's fewer NOAA codes that are below the minimum abundance. And in this model, we need to double check exactly how much shell we're planting in this, but it has a pretty strong increasing trend in shell over the course of this model. And so we need to double check to make sure we're doing that as it should be. So if I march through all of these for the remaining 7 performance measures, I can't keep track of all of them in my mind, so I suspect that most other folks aren't able to either. So I want to come up with an easier way or a more digestible way to show these kinds of results to you. And I'm going to propose one, and we can talk about whether it's useful or not and whether we want to do something else. But what we're going to do is we're going to summarize the results and look at differences. So what I have highlighted up here is I've pulled out harvest revenue from the status quo and from the seed and shell program option. And what we're going to do is we're going to summarize, on average, how much harvest revenue we get during 2023 to 2027 for a short-term performance measure, and during 2035 to 2044 for a long-term performance measure. And then what we're going to do is take the difference between the amount of, in this case, harvest revenue in the status quo model, the amount of harvest revenue in the seed and shell program model, and then we're going to make that relative to what's in the status quo. So what we end up with this is a % difference. So if this is higher, we might say, well, harvest revenue might be 50% higher under the seed and shell program than it is under the status quo. And so that's what we get is a % difference from the status quo. So we're basically saying, if we continue doing what we're doing, we get the status quo. But we're going to look at the other options relative to whether they're better or worse than the status quo across all these different performance metrics. And sorry, I'm losing my voice. I haven't talked this much in a while. So when we compare these options, what we end up with, or what I've plotted here, are what my wife has called flag plots, which I think is a clever name for them. And so let's take a look at the status quo here. What we have is each box is an option, and across this level, we have the different performance measures that we're looking at. So we start off with adult abundance, then market abundance, harvest revenue, surface shell, nitrogen removal from the oyster bars, nitrogen removal from oyster meats, amount or the fraction of the time we're above the harvest rate limit, fraction of the time we're above the harvest rate target, and fraction of the time we're below the minimum abundance threshold. And so if we look at the seed and shell program projections here, we can see that the reds mean the value's higher than the status quo. Blue means it's lower. One of the things I'm going to fix on these is to make it so it's consistent whether being higher or lower is good or bad. Right now with these graphs, for the first 6 performance measures, it's better to be on the red side. In the bottom 3, it's better to be on the blue side. So it's basically, it's better to have more oysters, it's better to have more harvest, it's better to have more shell, it's better to have more nitrogen removal. And it's also better to be above or be below the harvest rate limit more often. It's better to be below the target more often, and it's better to be above minimum abundance more often. And so in this case, The seed and shell, simulating the seed and shell program suggests we end up with more adult and market-sized oysters. It suggests that harvest doesn't change all that much, but there ends up being a lot more surface shell, and there ends up being more nitrogen removal and less often overfishing. And so, and this is for the short term. This is for 2023 through 2027. If we complete the restoration, the way the model is set up, the restoration isn't completed until after 2027 right now. So we need to modify those dates back to more what's in the plan. But right now, nothing happens relative to the status quo for that, which is how it should be. If we go back to the 2018 regulations that were in place, so both in terms of which areas are open to fishing, as well as the bushel limits and the Wednesday closure, the model doesn't have really strong differences associated with it. For that, they're fairly minor. The worst option out of all of these is what happens if we stop planting. So this is stopping planting spat on shell, natural seed, and artificial substrate. If we stop doing all those activities, the model suggests that adult abundance will start declining very rapidly. Harvest will decline even more rapidly, and the amount of shell will decline as well. And in addition to all that, we're going to end up more often of the time harvesting at a higher rate than what's expected from the stock or what's desired based on the reference points in the stock assessment, as well as we're going to end up below the abundance threshold more often. If we open those areas in the upper bay to power dredging, we end up with an increase, at least a short-term increase in harvest, as well as a short-term increase in having too high of a harvest rate. If we convert all the low harvest bars to sanctuaries, again, that does not do very much in the short term. We end up actually with some decreases in abundance, as well as fairly minor changes in harvest and in the harvest rate. If we open non-restoration sanctuaries to fishing, it looks very similar to converting bars to sanctuaries. Makes me think that maybe I implemented it wrong. We'll have to take a look at that. And then we have spat in upper bay sanctuaries. So part of that restoration ends up not doing a whole lot at the beginning, but it does reduce the one of the NOAA codes below makes it above the abundance limit threshold. So these are the short term, what happens during 2023 to 2027 on average. For the longer term performance, now we're looking at 2035 to 2044. This is where we should start to see bigger differences. And so for the status quo, again, it's being compared to itself, so it's all the same. For the seed and shell program, we see fairly substantial increases in adult abundance and market abundance, a bit more modest increases in the amount of harvest, large increases in the amount of shell. And then also a reduction in the amount of time where harvest rates are above their limit or target, and a reduction in the number of NOAA codes that are below their abundance limit. If the completing the restoration in the Minokan and St. Mary's rivers ends up suggesting higher levels of abundance, higher levels of harvest, as well as higher levels of habitat and nitrogen removal. This model in particular, at least it's not based on, well, it's based on how the fishery performed in 2019 relative to what happened in the years before that. But this model tends to suggest that changing back to the 2018 regulations would not have changed things very much. And so we end up with very similar levels of harvest and abundance relative to the status quo. Again, the options with removing planting does by far the worst out of all of them, and it has pretty much every performance measure going in the wrong direction from what we want to see. When we look at the power dredging in the upper bay, we end up with a bit less oyster abundance than under the status quo, and a bit more harvest than under the status quo, and a bit more frequent overfishing relative to the status quo, or harvest rates being above the harvest rate limit. When we look at low harvest bars being converted to sanctuaries, again, it's not very big changes, and opening those non-restoration areas or opening non-restoration sanctuaries to harvest, again, doesn't do a lot. And part of the reason for that is when we convert low harvest bars to sanctuaries, the model does not think there's many oysters in those low harvest bars to begin with, otherwise there'd be harvest there. And so turning them into sanctuaries doesn't do very much because it's not protecting any oysters. Similarly, opening all those sanctuaries, again, the model doesn't think there's a lot of oysters in most of the sanctuaries in Maryland, so opening them up doesn't do very much. And then the last is placing spat in sanctuaries and upper bays. Those options tend to increase abundance a little bit. They don't do very much to harvest or most of the rest of the reference points, but they do tend to decrease the abundance or the fraction of the time that those NOAA codes end up being below their minimum abundance threshold. And so what I haven't shown you here is the cost for the different options. After we ran all of these, I noticed something that looks weird that I have to go back and track down and figure out why it's not calculating some of the costs correctly. So I don't have a summary of the costs, but we are going to show you costs associated with each of these options at the next time you see this stuff. And also, as I said before, we have a number of other options that we already have teed up. We have an option for planting spat on shell and doing rotational harvest in the Chester River. So basically opening several of the sanctuaries up that were mentioned in previous OAC meetings and doing a rotational harvest there with spat on shell. And then we have 3 options from the Man-O-War Shoals permit application that we've tried to replicate in the model. And so the model is set up to be able to actually dredge a bar in the sense of a mining dredge of removing that shell as well as all the other material in the area that was dredged and taking that and moving it somewhere else. So it basically is a permanent loss to that oyster bar to do that. And then the last thing I want to mention is right now I'm planning on doing small group meetings during the week of May 24th. I haven't scheduled a time or dates yet for that, and it's something that I hope to get your feedback on. Some times of day or days of week that might work well for a group of people. I'm hoping to get somewhere in the neighborhood of 10-ish people in each of these sessions and doing 3 or 4 of these sessions during that week. So I expect that that'll be about 3 hours long to go through the model in a bit more detail, have you be able to ask whatever questions you want to ask of me, as well as to make recommendations about things that you think could be done better in the model, but we'll be going through all of that in detail. And with that, if people want to see specific results, I have results for all of those options, but I figured I have thrown enough stuff at you to start with. And so I'd like to chat about this and get any of your comments or questions that I can answer.
Hello, commissioners. Please raise your hand or place your question or comment in the chat for Dr. Wilberg. Commissioner Miller.
Thank you, Mike. I think my head is slowly stopping spinning, but I'm still not quite sure. So I want to go back to the shell that's available. And you noted when I asked you about things that you're concerned about, that sort of habitat availability, and I assume from that the amount of shell is part of that. Do you have a sense of why the uncertainties on your forecasts of shell are so constrained compared to every other variable?
It's partially because the main thing that's acting on the shell is the model starts off with a very large pool of shell relative to the pool of live oysters. And so pretty much what you're seeing in that decrease is just that 2.1% per year being applied to that really large pool of shell. The things that make it go up are the things that added variability in those plots were the amount of recruitment and survival and mortality of oysters. And so that added some variability to it. But the dominant process was that the model thinks there's this big pool of shell and that is slowly decaying over time because there aren't enough oysters to basically keep adding new shell back to what the model is estimating it's starting with.
And so the particularly low variation on the seed and shell program is driven in this case by you're telling the model what you're planting, I assume, and it's just believing that.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Harrison?
Yeah, Mike, I kind of had similar questions on that status quo. The shell was decreasing, and yet the harvest did tend upwards later on, and that just didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And then also on the seed and shell one, was that done bay-wide, or was that done like in the higher recruitment areas where you placed the shell? If you could answer those two questions.
Sure, let me pull up my slides for that. I think that will be a little bit better. Oops. Let's see if I can find it. So this is the shell plantings. It's mislabeled. It's not spat on shell, it's just shell. So this is where the shell is being planted in the spat on shell areas. And like I said, in the seed and shell option areas. And so I was surprised by how much of it is centered up in Eastern Bay. And so that might be one of the reasons why we see some of the results. But so we can definitely play around with where that seed and shell is actually put, but we just took this as basically saying, historically, this is where the seed and shell program was active. So we're going to do that as our first pass to bring to you for feedback. The other question was one about how you can have declining abundance and increase, or declining shell and increasing harvest and abundance. And I think what explains that is, we have different things going on in different parts of the bay. And so in the upper bay, there's a lot of shell that is thought to be up there based on our estimates. And so that's based on the sonar surveys that have been done. It's based on old estimates from the Bay Bottom survey. It's based on the Fall Dredge survey, as well as Patentong surveys that have happened up there. And I think that's one of the reasons why we can see that part to say, okay, we're losing shell, but the population is growing, is I think it's just happening in different parts of the bay. And to look at that, we need to look more fine-grained at the results to see where the population's going up and where it's going down. And unfortunately, I'm going to show you those graphs at some point, and it'll be a lot of materials to look through. But I think that's the explanation for some of those counterintuitive results.
Commissioner Colden?
Thank you. Mike, question for you. When you were explaining sort of how you applied the planting history in various places, like every 5 years out of 20, obviously through that time period, some of these areas became sanctuaries that were previously in harvested areas and may have been planted more regularly than or at all since they became sanctuaries. So did you apply that differently for areas that had happened, or did you continue to apply the same planting schedule after an area became a sanctuary?
I believe that we applied the same planting schedule after that area became a sanctuary. And so that's a really good point of something that's probably one of the changes we want to make to the way those options are implemented, is to recognize what their current status is as a sanctuary or not as a sanctuary. And so particularly these options where the major intent is to support the fishery, those ones, the majority of effort shouldn't go into planting in sanctuaries. But when I was looking through the maps as we were preparing for the presentation for this group, I noticed a few more things that looked a little bit off in the maps in places where there was planting in sanctuary there. So we need to go back and look at that. It's a lot harder to see when I'm just looking at tables of thousands of numbers. So it's miss a few things now and then.
Sure. I mean, I think that would be most important to as a tweak to the status quo. But personally, I think keeping the one in that if it was set up in this way where you kept the planting schedule, would be an interesting juxtaposition. Because I know a lot of us have wondered what the outcomes could or would have been if restoration plantings had been ongoing in those non-targeted tributary sanctuaries as well. So I think that would be an interesting one to keep in there if you've already got it programmed in. If I could have one more question, for your upcoming analysis on the Man-O-War shoal option, is that modeling just the reduction of shell from Man-O-War, or how are you treating the disposition of that? Because I know that's one of the biggest outstanding questions with the permit, is where does the shell go after it's removed from the shoal?
So if I'm remembering correctly, there's 3 different plans put forward in the permit application as to what happens with that shell, that describe a mix of that shell being used either for on harvest bars or on restoration areas, or a combination of the two. And so the ones that we've set up are ones that try to replicate the specific plans that were put forward in the permit application. And I don't remember more detail off the top of my head. And so I'll have that next time we talk about them.
Okay, thanks.
Commissioner Sowers?
That was my question, so I'm all good.
Thank you. Commissioner Kanaki and then Commissioner Judy.
Yeah, hi, Mike. And maybe my question was answered as well when you were describing those counterintuitive results. But if we could go back to the second before last slide, if that's possible, and you were showing those comparisons between, seed and shell and restoration versus the status quo. Well, that's not the one. I guess it's the next slide. I think the longer term. Yeah. So, man, maybe I missed something, so apologies. But looking at market abundance and seed and shell relative to the complete restoration, market abundance is higher. The change is higher in seed and shell. But then when you look at harvest, it's much lower in seed and shell relative to complete restoration. So is this another one of those counterintuitive results explained by regional differences, or what's your take on that?
I believe so. Those are ones we need to dig into so that I can give you a satisfactory explanation and actually show you what it's doing. But right now we haven't looked into the regional differences in these trends yet, but I suspect that's what's going on.
Gotcha. All right. Thank you.
Sure.
Commissioner Judy?
Yeah, Mike, just want to say thank you, as everyone else has, for all the hard work and these presentations, the slides, very helpful. So comment regarding the seed and shell, you alluded to it, that it could be refined, and you mentioned some ideas for how to refine that option. So I just wanted to echo that, for example, Eastern Bay, that was once a central planting area. You showed that on the map, but with spat set declining for Eastern Bay, it no longer is a real priority if we had a program going on now. So I think my recommendation would be, as you tweak the seed and shell program option, you could work with the department, with Waterman and others, targeting shell to areas where spat set would be occurring in the recent time frame. And also seed, same thing. So even though you did use the historic program to build your model, which was a very good approach to start with, build on what's been done before, because the Bay is so different, I think it would be good to tweak the model and make those adjustments. And the second thing is, regarding the sanctuaries, a few people have said it, I'll just echo it. Because sanctuaries are closed to harvest, even though we did once plant in places like Little Chop Tank or Harris Creek, et cetera, you could tweak the model where seed and shell plantings for industry should not be in the sanctuaries in the model. So thanks.
Yeah, Chris, thank you. And really that alludes exactly to where we're going to be going with all of this, is what the purpose of the model is to try and implement the options that the OAC wants to at least virtually test or consider what the performance might be. And so we're going to be asking you to provide feedback on what options do you want to see? How do we make them better in your opinion? And we want to have that dialogue to be able to build these things up. So that's exactly the direction we're going in.
Good. Yeah, glad to work with you. Thanks.
Commissioner Corson?
Yeah, thank you. Mike, could you clarify why in the seed and shell program you see a large increase in surface shell that's so much more, or why you think maybe, you see so much larger increase in surface shell than in abundance of oysters in general? I mean, I'm just trying to understand the relationship.
Sure. So I think what's happening is that in the model, whenever oysters get above a threshold abundance, they generally get harvested. And so the shell and seed oysters get placed. And once there's a certain amount of market size oysters there, those oysters get harvested. So it basically puts the way we've modeled the fishery, which I think is fairly realistic, it basically puts a cap on how many oysters we're going to see in the harvest area, because if there's a lot of oysters out there, eventually watermen will find them and they'll be harvested. And so that's why there's the cap, whereas for the shell, that's not being harvested. The shell stays behind. It does decay, but it's staying behind. And so that ends up staying there while the oysters get harvested. I think that's the reason for the difference between those two performance measures.
Do we have any other comments or questions for Dr. Wilberg?
Mike and Elizabeth, are you ready to do the?
Commissioner Colden has a question.
Okay.
Commissioner Colden?
Sorry, I was looking back at my sheet and I think it's been answered. So thank you.
Commissioner Breyer?
Like, just a question for the future. Are you going to be able to combine different management actions? And
yes,
and we can view the same sort of output if we were to combine a couple of different things, right?
Yep.
Cool. All right, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. It's basically the way we have this set up, we could do pretty much any combination of the stuff that we've showed you, as well as several things that we haven't showed you yet. And so there's a lot of possibility here for mixing and matching and doing a whole variety of different things. So basically, we can run simulations where we're changing the amounts of shell or spat on shell or natural seed or artificial substrate planted on any of the locations in the bay. We can modify if areas are open or closed to harvest for any of the polygons in the bay. We can modify what gears they're open to. We can implement a rotational harvest plan where areas are opened and then closed a number of years after, as well as the having areas designated as seed bars where seed is removed and moved to other places, and shell harvest areas like man-o-war shoals might be. And so basically any mix and match combination of those options is currently feasible in the model. And we can do them, we just need to know questions like, which areas do you want to have open to which things, or which things do you want changed from the status quo, how often they open, how often we do things, and we could simulate any of those options. So the sky is really the limit for that, which is another reason why it's so critical to have your input to make sure that we're actually implementing things that you're interested in knowing the answer for.
Commissioner Harrison?
Yeah, Mike, I wonder if it's factored in the amount of people harvesting, because I mean, right now we've hovered around 1,000 probably for the last 10 years. But I think going forward, and you're looking at 2045, I honestly believe that I don't think there's going to be 1,000 oystermen. Maybe even in the next 10 years, we could see a decline, and that decline would end up, if you have your limits, I mean, you know, and does it factor that you could limit out, you have a complete fishery, and so you're not catching all the oysters, and so the model would really change with the number of harvesters.
I think you're absolutely right, and that is a weakness of the model in its current form. And I'm sure Scott will be able to talk a bit to this as well. But essentially, what the model is doing is it's representing what we think future harvest rates are going to look like based on past ones. And so if there's major changes in, say, the number of watermen or other major changes in how many people are fishing or what they're deciding to fish for, all of those things will have an effect that we're currently not capturing in the model. I have racked my brain to try and figure out, given the information that we currently have and the time frame we have for this project, how we could implement a more realistic sort of waterman model on top of it. But I haven't been able to come up with something that is better than what we have right now. But that is a definite concern, and we can think about ways to potentially modify the model to represent that concern, although I suspect it'll be hard to come up with something that is very good.
Yeah, maybe I could jump in since you threw it at me, Mike. The decision to go, and this is an academic perspective, so forgive me. I don't harvest oysters for a living, but the decision to be an oyster harvester is one decision point, and that's a function of economic conditions and local communities and other alternatives outside of harvesting oysters. And then there's like how often to go. So there's like multi-level decisions that are occurring here. It's extremely complicated to model that. It's probably best to abstract away from that to the extent possible. Yeah.
Well, good. Thank you. I'm glad you didn't want me to put in one of your site choice models with an individual waterman model. So I appreciate it.
Any other comments, questions from commissioners?
Mike, can you take a look at the chat?
I just want to let, if there are any more questions from commissioners, we'll handle those first, and then we'll go to more the public questions. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions. So this is a question from Captain Newberry. In areas of low recruitment where the seed and shell is being planted according to the model, shell abundance will be greater than market oysters. If planted in high recruitment areas, markets will be higher. Planting in high recruitment areas needs to be put into the model. And I would, in general, agree with that and say that I hope the OAC will be able to help us determine or decide on options that have a better better distribution of the planting location so that we can model some of those.
Any more comments or questions?
So if there aren't more comments or questions on this, one of the things I wanted feedback on is, are there particular times during the week that work well for groups of people to have a 3-hour modeling meeting? And so I recognize it might be like torture for anybody to listen to another 3 hours of this, but one of the parts of the process is to try and make the modeling as clear as possible to you. And that's a two-way street. It's both so that we can make a better model, because you all know a lot of things about the oysters and oyster fisheries that we don't know on the modeling team, and we want to incorporate that knowledge to the best of our ability. And the other part is the better you understand the model, I think the better you'll understand what it can do as well as what it can't do. And so when we're doing that, and the other part is it lets us talk more about what kinds of options you might be considered in modeling out into the future, so we can try and get those in as good a shape as possible. As I alluded to earlier, we don't have all the time in the world. And so we want to try and use that time we do have as efficiently as possible so that we can complete this portion of the process. And so I would like to hear back either through the chat or just through comments about if there are specific times, like certain days of the week or certain times of day or combinations of those that will work well for people, that we can use that to schedule some sessions for this.
Commissioner Colden has her hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Memo. Mike, I was just curious with your request for additional items to be modeled through these meetings. Are we going to revisit sort of the 5 or 6 lists that we came up with in our previous breakout sessions, or are we sort of revisiting that in each one of these modeling meetings now that we've seen the model, or are we going to go back to the lists that have already been developed?
We can go back to the list that's already been developed, and that's something that we will recirculate. We were able to, there were several options that came up a lot over the course of multiple meetings. And so we've tried to implement those options, things like doing more restoration work in the Upper Bay, implementing the seed and shell program, lots of other things like that. So we've tried to implement those so far, but we can definitely, so the list of options I was working from was one that was circulated, I'm trying to remember, I think at the March meeting. And that was our kind of composite list we'd been maintaining up to that point. So we could go from that one again and redistribute it if people need to see it again.
Yeah, I would appreciate it if we could recirculate that. I think that would be super helpful. Thanks.
Cool.
Mike, there's a question for you from Chris.
Just a second. Writing notes and then I'll get to it.
Okay.
Um,
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, Mike, I didn't write it. So,
okay.
yeah, a number of watermen aren't here tonight, and of course, some are. So, do you know if there's general acceptance or some issue with having your daytime small group meetings? Do you know if watermen would prefer nighttime or some other, avenue? I didn't know if daytime was a problem.
That's exactly what I was trying to ask. So basically, by time of day, I just mean what time of day. I won't do them at midnight, but I am prepared to be quite flexible in this, and I'd be happy to do at least one session that would be an evening session, if that's what will work for folks. And so my goal with this is to try and do stuff that's accessible to people. However we can set that up to where people can participate, I want to try and maximize that.
Mike, we're recording the notes that our folks are putting on the chat, so we will share those with you tomorrow. In addition, we probably could do a quick doodle poll or a survey or something.
Okay.
Facilitate that. Simon Dean has his hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to reiterate nighttime, evening time is best for me. That's all.
Okay.
I can be pretty free any day of the week.
Cool. Thank you.
So when we do the debrief, Mike, we will decide on a doodle poll or some kind of poll to make that possible.
Yeah, I think we'll actually want to get it out faster than that because the 24th is coming up pretty quick, and I want to make sure people know about this far enough in advance to do it. We'll probably have to do some brainstorming isn't quite the right word, but maybe choose some time and ask people to sign up for them, and then we'll see which ones are filling up and which ones aren't, sort of thing, maybe.
Yeah, once you tell us what those times are for you, we can circulate a sign-up sheet as early as Wednesday. Commissioner Miller?
Mike, have you given any thought to the composition of these work groups? Is there some preference from you to have as much diversity at each meeting? Is there some sense from you that you want to try and make them more comfortable for individuals who may feel better making suggestions in one arena versus another? Is there anything we should be thinking about there?
My ideal would be to do these meetings in the full group. Just given our time frame that we're working under, we can't do that because I think it is important for people to hear the questions that other people are asking, as well as hear the responses to those questions, because those are exactly the things that get people's juices flowing to think about, oh, I hadn't realized we weren't doing this, or we were doing this, and gets things moving. Whereas when we have the smaller groups are both to make sure we're satisfying state law in terms of not having a more than a quorum of the voting members of a commission meeting together, but also just because I didn't expect that everybody would be able to meet, to be able to do it. So to me, it's most important that we get people to engage in the meeting so you can hear what the model is about, give your feedback, and we can try and make the model better for the OAC. If we can have a diversity of people in the groups, that would be great, because I think that sort of cross-pollination ends up being really helpful. But I see that as secondary after just trying to make the times accessible for folks.
Certainly, as someone whose timetable during the day is pretty well packed, I'm more than happy to do this of an evening as well.
Great.
Mike, Elizabeth, did you want to do the on-screen editing we talked about this afternoon, or we don't need that?
I'm not sure. I'm getting a sense that folks are a little bit worn down. But so the one other thing we had thought about doing was going through and looking at the options that we've already modeled and asked if there were specific changes beyond what we've already talked about. And if we could capture some of those, that would be great. I think we only have about 10 minutes more left, so it might be, I guess that's probably the best use of that time before we finish up.
Elizabeth, are you ready?
Yes, I am. I will share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
All righty.
Thank you for already taking notes on it, Elizabeth. The two comments I think we got back on seed and shell program for alternative options were to work with DNR and Waterman to target areas where spat sets are high today and avoid some of those where it might have been high in the, say, the 1990s. And then to make sure that in at least one of the options that's based on this, that we're putting the seed and shell plantings in areas that are open to harvest, as I think the primary goal of this option was to support industry. So are there other ways that people would like to see the seed and shell program modified? Allison.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate my comment from earlier. I think it makes this into two separate options, but just revisiting what I was saying earlier about the sanctuaries and their planting history. This one explicitly says make sure seed and shell plantings are not in sanctuaries. I think the one I was talking about earlier, which is already set up, I think is the one that maintains the planting history through the implementation of a sanctuary area. So kind of pulling that planting history for seed or shell forward in the non-targeted tributary sanctuaries.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. It's obviously easy to keep the same thing that we have in there. And one of the things that we'll do as some of this stuff we're planning on reporting out in future options are the amount of shell and seed and spat that are being planted, as well as the costs. And so we'll maybe for an option like that, we'll separate out how much of it's actually being done in the sanctuaries versus not, so we have a better handle of it.
So if I said, kind of make it as a separate option saying keep seed and shell activities in sanctuaries?
Keep seed and shell activities as they were in the historical seed and shell program. It's basically basically saying we should keep the first one as part of the mix. So don't discard it, but just add another option on that for the ones of not doing things in the sanctuaries. But I think that captures it. At least
is that right? Did I get that?
Yes. Well, no, as they were historically. So
as they were. Okay, good.
So Mike, we would basically have two scenarios to compare. One would be the same old program as it was conducted, including in the current sanctuaries. The second would be modify the model to not plant in those sanctuaries, because if we had an actual program, we would not plant in the sanctuaries for the industry.
Exactly.
We would compare through the model those two results.
Yep.
Okay.
Next is Commissioner Sowers.
Hi, guys. The 5 restoration tributaries do have planting plans. So they initially get planted, and then in areas where, like in the Tread and Harris, there's been additional plantings over time to try to develop the populations and get multi age assemblages. So I don't know how that factors into any of this, and I think you're aware of that, but I just wanted to identify, call that out for any modeling that's going on with relevance to the sanctuaries, that there are plantings still planned and occurring in those areas.
Yeah, so in order to implement those as they're currently being done, the thing that we're missing in the model to do that is the current extra sanctuary plantings are done based on the results of the survey and whether or not the abundance levels are thought to need more plantings or not. And so right now we don't have that sort of survey implemented to say, okay, we're just going to plant if abundance is above or below this threshold.
Sure, yeah.
I'll think about how we can do that, but obviously that is a part of the plan that it would be good to do. It's just not trivial to represent those surveys.
Gotcha. And if it's not determined that it makes sense to do it, then I think just recognizing that, in the documentation of whatever is modeled, that it's not, there's no additional plantings in the sanctuaries if it's determined that that doesn't fit in.
Yep, absolutely. We will definitely document it regardless, and we will also see whether or not we can more realistically mimic what has been happening and what's planned to happen.
Thanks.
Commissioner Miller?
Thank you, Memo. So we've worked to put in areas where spat set is high, and presumably we have data on this from the DNR fall survey. When you started your presentation this evening, you mentioned the data that drove the estimate of the loss of shell being at 20% or more. And I think it was Jeff Harrison that asked you the foundation for that. Is there any possibility of doing model runs where we think the loss rate of shell is perhaps less, so that you're not having to constantly feed the beast, so to speak, that if you plant once, it may last more than 5 years before you have to come back?
So absolutely, there's the possibility of doing this. And the way I would say is the best way to do it is that we'll have several different aspects of the model we're not sure about that we want to test, that we're going to identify. And then once we get a more final set of options, we'll run all those options with different models about how the world works. And so in one model, it might use the shell loss rates that we just showed you. In another model, we might make the assumption that the loss rates are actually less than that. And then the idea is we want to look at, is the best option that we had under one set of conditions still the best option in the other? Or do the options start flipping around which one's best based on that? And so in general, for this kind of modeling, those things are called robustness trials. The idea is the best option going forward robust to what we are pretty sure we don't know very well? And so absolutely we can do that. It's just identifying which of those processes we think is critical to evaluate, because realistically, we can probably do about a half dozen of those sorts of robustness trials, I'm guessing. It won't be a lot more than that. And so we just want to make sure we're capturing the uncertainties that people are most concerned about.
So that, Mike, is a general, as you said, a general approach to the robustness about the assumption. I was thinking more about selecting specific areas based upon some knowledge of their shell loss. And I get the impression that you don't think there's the data there to do that.
Yeah, I don't think we can estimate spatial differences in shell loss very well.
Okay.
Commissioner Swanson?
Sorry, I had to get my phone off mute. Just a question about alternative substrate. And, when I guess what I'm wondering is it possible to look at some of the non-restoration areas, some of the sanctuary areas that have been perhaps mid to low producers, and continue to work some in the models, some with shell, some with alternative substrate, just to see, because we might end up, if we have alternative substrate in the mix, have more hard bottom available. So I don't quite know how to ask for the run, but what I'm trying to get at is, could we end up stretching our ability to do more plantings if we were using more alternative substrate?
So we can definitely do those sorts of evaluations and make up an option that includes putting artificial substrate in sanctuaries.
Because again, what I'm thinking about is that, particularly with what we learned from Virginia, there are different ways to grind that substrate, so that perhaps we could be really trying to work to make sure that we're using these alternative substrates that are friendly to harvest over time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Commissioners, we have time for two more, and we have Simon Dean, and then we have Allison Colden.
Yeah, this is more of a comment, not so much a question. I think this whole discussion of loss of shell, loss of habitat, I think, Mike, earlier in the discussion, you said that the shell wasn't necessarily lost. It was a matter of, it was covered, it was buried. I think that really lends merit to my whole argument that we need to really think about bagless, bag in, bag out dredge to try and reclaim some of this bottom. The habitat we need is at the source. The source is at the place we need it. Thank you.
Certainly, and one of the reasons we didn't develop, well, there's two reasons why we didn't develop a bagless dredging scenario to test in the model. The first is that there was a previous study done a while back by DNR that suggested that they couldn't detect an effect of bagless dredging. And again, that kind of goes back to some of the stuff we've talked about before of with oysters in Maryland, where we don't get a consistent spat set from one year to the next, it can be difficult to know whether it was just by bad luck, a bad year's spat set. So regardless of what you did, you weren't going to get any oysters, or whether there wasn't a strong effect of that activity. And so that was my main reasoning for not building it in yet. That's another option that we can definitely look back in to see what sort of information we can find on it and include it. But siltation is definitely an issue. It's well documented around the bay. And so I agree entirely with you on that. It's how we model it is the tricky part, given that we don't have many studies of it.
And the last one will come from Commissioner Colden.
I had a thought about how some of these sanctuary areas were originally identified. I think there was an analysis done in like 2009. A lot of people, I think, refer to it as the best bar analysis. And the target was set at 50% of the best bars by number went into sanctuaries, and 50% remained open harvest areas. And that's how we ended up with our 25% by area sanctuaries we have now. And just thinking about Jeff's Jeff's comments earlier about how the productive areas have changed, I would be interested to see if we were to do a similar type of analysis. And maybe this would be facilitated by the next 5-year report that the department is working on. Would those areas be the same? And if we were to implement that similar type of breakdown in the model, what the results would be.
Yeah, I haven't done that analysis, and I'm only I know what analyses you're talking about, but I don't remember the details of the Rothschilds and Jones analysis. I think it would, as you said, have to go back to the 5-year plan to look at that. But I can tell you that the high spat set areas have definitely changed. Historically, there were very high spat sets, as Chris said before, in Eastern Bay, and the spat set has been very low there throughout the 2000s. And so I think we would see pretty substantial shifts in where those high spat sets are.
Mike, before we end this, take a quick look at the chat. There's a comment from Sean Corson.
Mm-hmm. So Sean has said that there's historical shell budgets that have been generated, and there's some debate about how consistent the loss rate is across different salinity, temperature, and bottom type. Is there a way to get a loss rate from it? And so this is one of the things I've been kind of pulling my hair out about, which you might not be able to see over Zoom, but I'm sure you could in person. The loss rates that have been suggested in the literature are extremely variable. In one of the studies at VIMS estimated that shell is lost at a rate of 40% per year, which I think something went wrong with that study. I don't believe those estimates, because if that was true, there should be no shell left in Chesapeake Bay. But even the lower shell rate loss estimates are ones from Delaware Bay, which were like 15% per year. And if we put those into the model, which we started off with early on, you just end up with no shell left in the bay. And so these attempts to do shell budgets historically, I think, have missed some of the important dynamics about how shell is working. And when they've looked at shell rates, they've basically done experiments where they take a bunch of loose shell, put it in a tank, or weigh it, put it in a tank, and then weigh it when it comes out and see how much less it weighs. And I don't think that represents well the long-term process of how shell acts in the system. So at least if it does act that way, it's surprising to me that we have any oysters or any shell in the bay. So I find it very difficult to bring information from those other shell budget studies into what we're doing.
Thank you, Mike. We're going to now go to Quinn for the public comments part of the meeting.
The next business order is public comment. Public comments are limited to 2 minutes per speaker. Public comments longer than 2 minutes will need to be submitted in writing. Mr. Mortis.
Yes, I'm the proxy for the Baltimore County Shell Committee. I have one question. Do we have a list of approved substrates yet?
I'll let Chris Judy handle that question.
We certainly have a list of substrates, shell, stone, clamshell, mixed shell. There's all kinds of different substrates, and they're all basically approved. It depends on the use. So whether it's a sanctuary, a harvest bar, or whatever, there's a permit process and a public process to see which material would be used in what location. So there are approved materials, and in terms of details, it depends on what the specific project is.
Okay, that answers my question.
Captain Newberry.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Mike, I want to thank you for your presentation. And the one thing you were touching on was about just recently, you finished up your talk, was about the loss of shell. About 2.5 weeks, maybe 3 weeks ago, I participated. We went down and went on a shell hunt down in the southern bay, specifically down around the Holland Island area. And we located some shell in that area that, just to let you know, was planted probably between 30 to 40 years ago from Langenfelder. And some of it was buried, some of it wasn't buried very far, but the abundance of that shell and the amount of the shell was pretty spectacular. So I do agree with you that if, like some people have said that it's 7 years and shell goes away and oxygen destroys it and everything, there's some shell that's been in areas that has been untouched for 10,000 years that's still there. Why it's still there, even though it is covered with mud, it may not have been covered with mud 2,000 years ago, but it's still there. So I do appreciate you making the point on the fact that, if shell was lost at 40% per year, we wouldn't have any shell left in the bay, period, anywhere. So I think that needs to be looked at. And also on the seed and shell program, I do want to thank you very much for the presentation on the graphs. I mean, it is spectacular to see how that has turned out as far as on your model where the seed and shell program goes, but specifically if it was put in areas of high recruitment, because towards the end of the seed and shell program, we were concentrating on putting it in the back cove area down in the lower bay and in other areas that with, high salinity and whatnot. But, as far as putting it in Eastern Bay, I do believe that if you did put your model and ran it through point specific areas of high recruitment, I think you would find that your facts would be off the chart, and there would be more abundance of marketable product, and also it would probably correlate and run the same line as the buildup of shell abundance. The other thing that concerns me though is we're looking at a lot of these things with the OAC, specifically about what's been done and what's working and what's not working. I'm seeing in some of your models there that basically, I mean, correct me if I'm interpreting it wrong, but it doesn't look like the sanctuaries are doing much of anything. Even no matter what you throw at it, they just don't seem to be doing anything. And when I look at the money that is being spent by the government, which is our tax dollars going into areas specifically of areas like the complex down there in the Choptank River complex, I look at the money that was put into Harris Creek and then look at the results we're getting out of an area like Broad Creek. I mean, it's, the money, there's no factor. We're participating in the industry of putting money back in there that doesn't even scratch the surface of the 30 million put into Harris Creek, but we're getting an 1,800 spat count with some 800 count in that same area, is less than a mile as the crow flies. So I think a lot of this needs to be looked at too, what nature is going to do. And I just certainly hope that, year before last and last year were good spat sets. It looks like this year is going to be another probably very good spat set. Looks like we're heading into a dry year with a high salinity level. We don't see much in disease. So I certainly hope that we can move forward with the OAC and start, I hate to use the comment, stop dragging our feet and start getting some seed and some shell on bottom, because if we miss this opportunity this third year, it could be, could be better next year, but it could take that downhill slide. I think we need to accelerate we all want one thing. We want more oysters in the bay. So we need to really get moving forward with this program. So I think the seed and shell program is the way to go. I mean, looking at it, you might run some other factors. Some people might not like it. Some people might like it. And just my final comment on the 3-hour meeting you want to have, take into consideration a lot of the watermen that are on here are, they're oyster committee members. A lot of the guys were getting ready to start planting seed and, the shell for our shell program. It's probably not going to last that long, but that time frame, even in the evenings, if these guys are going to be on the run boats or going out and setting buoys, like I'm sure Jeff does and everybody else, it's going to be, difficult for them to get in. So just take that into consideration. And plus, with crabbing season starting, everybody's busy from sunrise to sunset. So I thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any more public comments?
So Quinn, if I can just say a couple of things in response to those. Thanks for the observations about the shell, and that's in the loss rates that we have in the model include burial. So it's not like the shell is gone. It's just that it's not available to oysters right now, the way we have it. So I think it aligns well with the observations you just described. We're definitely going to do alternative versions of the seed and shell program that probably redistribute at least most of the shell down to the lower bay, and maybe we think more about where the seed goes after that, because I was actually surprised when we looked at the maps that there were seed areas up in Eastern Bay in places where there's very low recruitment nowadays. And so if we're replicating seed areas up there, the model's probably going to say there's not going to be much recruitment up there if you put shell up there. And so I suspect by tweaking some of those things that one will get quite a bit better. The last thing, the comment on sanctuaries. The specific ones we looked at today are what happens in the non-restoration sanctuaries. And most of the non-restoration sanctuaries were not areas of high oyster abundance before they became sanctuaries, and they're still not areas of high oyster abundance. And I think that bears out what the modeling suggests. And so expecting areas that are low oyster abundance to turn around to areas of high oyster abundance without doing anything else is probably a dream that won't be realized. So that aspect of sanctuary performance is not very good. In the areas where we do have restoration, oyster abundances are demonstrably much higher. And so from that perspective, those restorations are, I would say, are a success. The question about them is whether they're having some of the spillover effects into the neighboring regions that some folks anticipated. And I think that is something to see. Historically, Broad Creek was always a better producing area than Harris Creek, no doubt about it. And so Broad Creek has always been one of the best producing areas in the Bay, or at least over the last 30 or 40 years it was. And so that's something that is definitely out there. And I think the model captures those historical patterns pretty well. Because it will track that Broad Creek is more productive on average than the other areas of the Bay. So, but thank you for the comments.
Thank you. There's no further business and there's no objection. The meeting will be adjourned. There being no objection, the meeting is adjourned, and the next meeting will be Monday, June 14th.
Mike, Elizabeth, Chris, Quinn, can you stay?
Will do.